In the biogeographical region today, we will be discussing about the Australia. Australia is a continent and it is unique in a way that it has been isolated not only in the past and even today. So, the history, characteristics, and biogeographical affinities of the biota of Australia are the most unusual and interesting because their explanation requires a rewarding understanding of interplay between a continental movement, climate change, and biotic dispersal. So, continental change, first discuss that. The continents change, they separate from one continent to another, and they are separating. For example, in case of Australia, it's separated from the Antarctica. If it separates, what happens to its climate? When the climate changes, the dispersal of organism happens, and some of those organisms which are spread to this particular island of a continent, what will happen, that some of them will be able to adapt to that environment and they will evolve into much successful species there. And all of these check marks can be studied with the continent of Australia. It is very unique, and we can study that in all the aspects of its biodiversity, its history, its paleontology, as well as its climate change. So, by the Middle and Late Cretaceous, Gondwana had lost both India and Africa and only retained only a narrow connection with the South America, so that Antarctica and Australia was the most substantial remnant of the old subcontinent. So, the Gondwana was losing land, and only thing that was remaining is Antarctica and Australia, and a very small connection with the South America. Its fauna included the marsupial mammals. Of course, there were very much other plants as well, right? So, which were indigenous to the landmark. But as we are discussing about the mammals or the zoogeography, the marsupial mammals are of interest here. So, marsupial mammals are different from the placental mammals. In the placental mammal, there is placenta. Placenta is connection between the mother and the child, and it nourishes the child in the womb of the mother. But in case of marsupial mammals, the fetus, they are not as much developed, and there is no placental connection. Instead, there is a pouch-like structure in these mammals, in which that the fetus or the undeveloped child or is developed, and it will develop in that pouch by nourishing there, right? So, in this way, the marsupial mammals are different from the placental mammals, and these were the mammals which were the successful group in the Australia. So, in the early Cenozoic, when its marsupials were undergoing their great radiation. Radiation, we have discussed that in detail in the paleontology as well. That means they were diverging into different species, whose diversity parallel of that of absent placentals. It was also the time and environment in which the songbirds, which were oscines, started their diversification. So, songbirds, they developed in the Australia, and also the placental mammals, they radiated and they filled out the niches just like a placental mammal would do in any other continent. So, the oscines that dispersed to Asia in Eocene, where their descendants started the worldwide radiation that today comprises nearly half of all living species of the bird. So, oscines, the songbirds, these are making the 50% of all the biodiversity of bird species, and they were originated from the Australia. They migrated towards the Asia, and now they have radiated all over the world. So, Australia only started to move rapidly northward 46 million years ago in the Eocene. So, there is movement of Australia as well towards the northward, and that was 46 million years ago. By the early Oligocene, around 35 million years ago, it had separated sufficiently far from the Antarctica for the deep water Antarctica circumpolar current of cool water and associated westerly wind to become established. So, what happened, that the Antarctica separated from the Australia. Now it has separated so much that between them the circumpolar, that means there is a current of cold water, the cooled water, that is circumpolar, that means it is rotating across the south pole, across throughout the Antarctica, and it is having a cooling effect all over it, and due to that there was much more glaciers coming onto that Antarctica, and now that it is the harsh and the warm environment of Australia has separated from the Antarctica, it started cooling down more. So it happened, the cooling of Antarctica, and the Australia on the other hand increase its arid and desert areas. So when it is separated from the Antarctica, it became warm. Of course it is moving towards the north, towards the tropics, and it is getting much more sunlight as well, and there is not much of a mountain range there, only one mountain range is there. So its soil conditions are not very good, because there was not when there are mountain ranges, the rains take up all the nutrients from the mountain due to the erosion, and nitrates and sulfates, they are coming with it, and they are making the soil rich. But in the Australian soil there is not that richness, because there was no such mountains, or the large mountains were present. So Australia's northward movement brought it into the 30 degrees south high pressure zone of low rainfall, so there is no rain. Australia became increasingly arid from the late Oligocene and into Miocene, and Australia's annual rainfall is also extremely variable due to the El Niño events in the Pacific, right? So El Niño events are the events of the weather patterns, you can say, or just like monsoon, there are the El Niño events which are influencing the weather patterns in the East Asia as well as the Western South and North Americas. So the mammals of Australia had to adapt to these climatic changes, and the fauna is made up of marsupial alone plus the few egg-laying monotremes. They have radiated into great variety of forms, occupying the niches that placental have filled everywhere else in the world, as we have discussed earlier. And the marsupial equivalent of rats, mice, squirrels, gibbons, moles, badgers, anteaters, rabbits, cat, wolves, and bears all look very like the placental counterparts, and only the kangaroo looks quite unlike placental equivalent, which is horse, which is interesting that the kangaroo is the equivalent of horse in Australia. And molecular results show that arboreal possum families radiated in the Eocene in the Nothofagus forests, and the early marsupial herbivores such as kangaroos and wallabies appeared after the Iranian grassland ecosystem appeared in the Pliocene. So we will be discussing about the biomes that are found in the Australian continent as well. So apart from humans and the aerial bats, only the rats spread naturally as far as Australia. So only 3 species: the humans, aerial bats, and the rats. So 50 species now form 50% of the diversity of the Australian land mammal fauna, and human belong to probably arrived 60,000 to 40,000 years ago and brought the domestic dog, the ancestor of the dingo, which is the native dog of the Australia, about 3,500 years ago. So here you can see the map of Australian biomes: monsoonal tropics, seasonal wet, southeastern temperate, and aseasonal wet, and then there are the southwestern temperate, and the large grassland Iranian. So all of these are the Australian biomes, which are hosting whole range of the Australian biodiversity.